1982 is a pretty good year for the arcades. The likes of Ms. Pac-Man, Dig Dug, Joust, Zaxxon, Q*bert and Robotron all made their arrivals, and initially I wondered if I'd have to increase the number of games that I'm covering here from 10 to 15. However, I'm sticking with 10, mainly because we've got a pretty damn strong set here, definitely higher quality than what we had in 1981. A lot of them are maze games, but they're really special ones that differ pretty significantly from the usual Pac-Man ape-in affairs that we've seen previously, and several of them are both seriously successful and seriously influential. A common theme is of games that are certainly much bigger deals than people generally think they are when you consider other titles that were inspired or changes that they represented in the industry. Indeed, our first game is a pretty damn big example of that, a game that introduced a means of selling arcade titles that, in the end, almost everyone else would follow. And so, let's get going. The big Japanese games come in first, but we've also got appearances from stalwart American amusement companies like Stern and Rockola, a trio of successful European titles, and, well, the usual rather strange efforts at the end that didn't quite hit the mark, but should still be highlighted. Here we go. Mr. Do is a pretty frickin' big deal. We're talking about a game that sold tens of thousands of copies here, and normally I wouldn't include it in a video like this one, where the games aren't supposed to be quite so well known. Yet, much like the case of Crazy Climber in 1980, I think Mr. Do is another case where people don't necessarily realise how important this game was in the world of the arcade. Universal's title essentially helped to change the way that arcade games were sold by virtue of being the first arcade game to be sold primarily as a conversion kit, as opposed to a dedicated arcade cabinet. This would be a massive deal. Operators could take this game, which ran on pretty generic Z80 based hardware, and change up another cabinet that wasn't performing so well or had run its commercial course on the floor, sticking Mr. Do in there without having to purchase a whole new cab. It's an altogether cheaper option, and the success of the game meant that many others would follow in its wake, even if Universal themselves were never quite able to repeat Mr. Do's phenomenal success. It certainly helps that the game is fantastic. It's a maze game where you play as the titular clown and you've got to collect those cherries, but it's not the usual rip-off of Pac-Man that we've seen previously. Instead, Kazutoshi Ueda, the game's creator, was instructed by Universal's president, Kazuo Okada, to make a game that was inspired by another Namco title, that being Dig Dug. It helped greatly that, as hugely successful as Dig Dug was, Namco didn't actually have a lot of initial interest in quickly following it up with a sequel, and so Mr. Do ultimately picked up Dig Dug's ball and ran with it. It helps even more that, in all honesty, Mr. Do is a much better and more complex game. Sure, you're still making your own maze by digging through the terrain, and you can still drop rocks, or apples rather, on enemies that are pursuing you, but there's a whole bunch more going on. You've got the power ball that can bounce around the maze and hopefully strike a creep before it returns to you. You've got the special bonus modes where you're able to take on the alpha monster and ideally score loads of points, and you've got various other major differences. In many ways, Mr. Do is actually like a proto-stealth game, one where you can tunnel in such a way that doesn't necessarily attract the attention of the creeps, and when you do, well, you ought to be prepared. The creeps are generally faster than you, and they'll likely catch you eventually unless you're ready with a powerball, or if you can drop an apple on them. That's quite different from the more aggressive play you find in Dig Dug, and there's a fair bit more depth to it. All of this was enough to make the game very successful indeed, enough to keep it in the charts for a couple of years, and enough to spawn several sequels, some of which we may well end up seeing in other videos. Nothing ever came quite close for Universal to the success of this first title though, and Mr. Do warrants a place right up there with the very best of the Golden Age. Its importance cannot be overstated. By the time we get to the end of the 1980s, most arcade games are sold in kit form to the point where it is basically the standard, and it all started right here with Mr. Do. I could have possibly covered Berzerk in the 1980 video, although at the time I thought it was a bit too big for the video, and perhaps a little bit too well covered compared to a couple of the other big hitters I wanted to look at. One in particular especially doesn't wish to go into the various urban legends and all of that, as that's definitely been done. Frenzy, the still successful but much lesser known 1982 sequel, is, however, definitely one I want to cover. It's a sequel that's still largely working with the same basic elements that Berzerk has, particularly in the graphics department, and yet it manages to be a rather different experience. Essentially, it's a bunch of ideas that the original's creator, the late great Alan McNeil, brought together just before he departed Stern. Once again, it's still one man versus an endless army of robots trapped inside a maze where ultimately there is no exit, and it's a question of just how many of these andro bastards you can take down before they inevitably overcome you. But as a sequel, Frenzy isn't so much the typical case of adding more fins. Instead, a lot's actually changed. The walls are no longer electrified. One of the big mechanics in Berzerk is leading those robots into touching the walls and destroying them that way, but you can't do that here. However, that does mean they provide better cover for the player, seeing as you can hug them more, and you can still use the regular walls for ricochets, so long as you're careful not to zap yourself in the process. Indeed, instead of simply leading the bots into electric walls, it's actually much more satisfying if you lead them into blasting themselves and each other when they shoot the walls. One of the main additions is dotted walls. You and the robots can shoot these dots out, and you can ideally then use these little gaps as a way of shooting them. It is often easier to do that as opposed to taking them on out in the open, as whether it's a skeleton or an eyeball, they're both pretty quick on the draw. One of the biggest changes comes with the game's signature enemy, the dreaded Evil Otto, the smiley face that appears after you've been on the screen for a bit too long, originally inspired by both Alan McNeil's hatred of smiley faces being used in everything, and a certain security guard who made sure everyone at Stern's headquarters was out of the office at lunchtime. The big question players had about the original was whether you could actually kill Evil Otto, which of course you couldn't. He's utterly invincible. However, he can be killed in Frenzy. You shoot him once and he gets a neutral expression, you shoot him again and he frowns, blast him one more time, and he dies. However, he is immediately replaced by a new Evil Otto that's moving very rapidly towards you, so you best watch out when you do this. You do also get a few special rooms that appear every 4 rooms. One's got a big Otto that doesn't move, but sends 4 top speed Ottos at you if you destroy the smiley one, and there's also a power plant, central computer, and robot factory. The plant and computer will have different effects on the robots if they're shot, either stopping them completely or making them behave erratically, while the factory just endlessly pumps out robots until you leave. Unlike the first game, Frenzy won't call you a chicken if you leave a room without destroying all the bots, and in fact the game generally speaks a lot less, although it is still cool when it does. The changes in Frenzy make the game feel even more like a proto-cover shooter than the first game does, one where mindless blasting is simply going to get you turned into a pile of ashes very quickly, where you need to be aware of how the robots behave and move at all times, and figure out the best way to get the drop on them in a maze that never repeats. It is honestly a brilliant sequel, and one you should absolutely play if you love the original. It may not look much different, but it's got a whole lot going on. Our next 2 games both deal with fins that are very slender, very flexible, and very long. However, they are not adult games, so I'll thank you for taking your mind out of the gutter. First up, we've got the brilliant Anteater. This game was developed at Stern, but the publisher was a very short-lived outfit named Tago Electronics, who only ever released a couple of games and I'm pretty sure ended up getting bought out by Stern, and the creator of the game was Chris Oberth, who we previously saw in the last video when we covered Armoured Car. The goal of the game is to eat those dots or ant larvae, but again this is a totally different beast from the puck norm. You control the anteater's tongue as it extends through the anthill, being sure to quickly retract it if fully grown ants are about to attack it, and eating them with the tip of your tongue. Worms also cause a problem and have to be eaten from behind. Again, get your mind out of the gutter. And you can also eat the queen ant at the bottom, which will temporarily clear the screen. Of course, you've got to get all those dots munched before time runs out, at which point an invincible spider attacks. This game is tough as all hell, but you get used to having to retract that tongue quickly before too long, and it becomes a very enjoyable act of taking risks and ideally getting rewards, feeling braver and braver as you extend your tongue further into the hole and twist it around. Also, while Anteater clearly isn't the first game to spawn successful and not necessarily official computer versions, it's a bit of an interesting one where said computer versions are perhaps even more famous than the original arcade. First off, Sierra scored a big hit in 1983 with Oil's Well, initially for the Apple II, Atari 8-bit and C64. It may have essentially been an Anteater clone with a different theme, but this was quite successful indeed, and won a lot of awards. Chris Aberth ended up creating his own computer version of Anteater, also with a different name. Ardy Liardvark also came out in 1983, originally for the Apple II. Now, while you would perhaps imagine that this was done so that Oil's Well didn't totally steal Aberth's thunder, according to a 2006 Retro Game in Times interview with Aberth, Ardy Liardvark was likely completed before he even saw Oil's Well, although he wasn't totally sure. Whether it's arcade or computer, it's a pretty damn good game. Next up is the wonderfully named Nibbler, another classic maze game. This is one of the few original arcade games released by Rockola, a company that started in 1927, is most famous for their jukeboxes, and is happily still making jukeboxes today, although it's now actually owned by a British company. Nibbler was Rockola's most successful arcade by a long distance, and it's a classic. Here you have to move a snake around the maze, and the snake gets slightly bigger every time it eats a dot. And so, much like in classic snake games, you have to move the snake in such a way that the head doesn't collide with another part of it. We're not making an Ouroboros here. The genius of Nibbler, especially amongst arcade games, is that the snake is the only moving part of this whole deal. It is perhaps the fairest arcade game of them all, as success or failure entirely depends on you. If you lose a life, well, you didn't get bested or jumped on by an enemy, you quite simply screwed up and didn't do it right. And don't think that just because there's no enemies, the game isn't tough. The snake gets a lot faster as you go through the waves, making it harder to go through tight corners and chicanes, and you can't just stop and ponder your next move, as if you dawdle for any length of time, the computer will make a move for you, usually right into the side of the snake, so you've got to keep moving. Funnily enough, this whole mechanic was kind of born out of the creator's personal leanings, according to Golden Age arcade historian's history of Rockola. Joe Ulovets, the main man behind Nibbler, was a pacifist, and he wanted to create a game where you could only hurt yourself and no one else. As an idea, it's a stroke of genius, and frankly one that I would have loved to have seen in more arcade games. The exact sort of thing that makes Nibbler so particularly appealing, and something you want to go at again and again, and it proved to be a hit. Another big reason for that was its scoring system. Nibbler was the first game to feature a 9-digit score display thanks to another man at Rockola's gaming division, Larry Gleason, and Rockola ran a competition, offering a free cabinet to the first person who could turn the score over by earning 1 billion points. This caught a fair bit of fire in the competitive gaming world, with several players gunning for the score, and it took a little over a year from the game's December 1982 release for it to finally happen. On January 17, 1984, at Twin Galaxies in Ottumwa, Iowa, local player Tim McVeigh managed to earn the 1 billion points after nearly 45 hours of continuous play, earning the cab and the key to the city. Amusingly, this whole competition, which is also covered extensively in a 2015 documentary called Man vs Snake, ended up outlasting Rockola's own involvement in arcade games. They closed the coin-op division in 1983 as the North American crash started to take hold. Much like Pac-Man in 1981, 1982 saw a whole lot of games based on Donkey Kong. However, Kangaroo is one of the earliest ones to be actually notable. This is one of the earliest games from a company called Sun Electronics. They're still around today as the Sun Corporation, and they are much better known for releasing titles under the brand of Sunsoft. While Kangaroo wasn't a massive hit or anything, it certainly gained a fair bit of notoriety, enough to briefly have a cartoon based on it as part of CBS's Saturday Supercade programming. Anywho, our Kangaroo simply needs to reach the top of each stage in order to rescue her baby Joey, and she's not wholly defenceless. She wears a set of boxing gloves that she can use to punch things, usually either the monkeys that are dotted around the stage, or the apple cores that they chuck in your direction. There's fruit that you can pick up for bonus points, a bell that you can ring on each stage that spawns more fruit, and various different aims. One stage, for example, has you repeatedly punch out a load of monkeys that are holding up the Joey's cage. This is something of a crude game in many ways. The graphics are kind of ugly and glitchy for 1982. There's not much point at all in grabbing fruit that spawns from winning the bell, as it's usually below you and too dangerous to get. And the jumping and general movement just feel a little off, especially when you're going from platform to platform. And yet, I like Kangaroo. Something about it just seems to have a lot of charm, and charm goes a hell of a long way. It's more appealing than a lot of other con-inspired games from this time, even if it is clearly a rather cheap effort. Atari certainly seemed to push it, converting it to both the 2600 and 5200. It perhaps holds up better to time layer than the 2600's conversion of Donkey Kong does, although if you actually look at the behind the scenes from Gary Kitchen on that game's development, which, no, was not purposefully hamstrung by Coleco to make their own console look good, it's a wonder he managed to get Kong going as well as he did on the machine. Anywho, I digress slightly. Kangaroo is certainly kind of rubbish in a few ways, to be sure, and yet it is still kind of fun. Sometimes that can't really be justified. The second half of this video starts with a trio of European games. All of these titles managed to get some traction outside of their home continent, and they're pretty decent quality. Definitely slicker than the cheaper, terrible rip-offs and the like that you might see from Century Electronics or whoever. We've got a game from France and two from the UK, and we're starting with the French one, Bagman by Valadon Automation, which ended up going worldwide thanks to Taito in Japan and Stern in the States, where it was particularly successful and was amongst 1983's best performing coin-ops. You've got one level, but it consists of 3 screens that you can go into at any time, and the objective is to collect all the money bags and put them in your wheelbarrow up at the top, which you can also move around. Guards endlessly chase you and minecarts can run you over, although you have a couple of ways of defending yourself. You can pick up a pickaxe to twat the guards with, and if you're carrying a money bag you can either drop it when you're on a ladder to hit them, or slide it down an incline. The guards are only stunned for a few seconds though, so you best get moving quickly, and often the only way to move fast, especially if you're carrying a bag, is to ride a minecart, which obviously isn't always an option. So yes, while there's a lot of things that Bagman can actually do, there's a lot of ways in which he can die. Bagman is infamously brutal, even by Golden Age standards, but again there's a lot of personality here. The arcade cabinet itself is great, even coming with a little comic strip that explains the game's rather simple plot, and the graphics and sounds, complete with amusing little speech samples, are thoroughly nice. And so you're happy to continue bashing against the wall, trying and usually failing to get all those bags before you end up losing in one way or another, trapped by the guards once again, accidentally falling down a shaft, not quite outrunning that cart and getting flattened. It's not for the timid, but Bagman is wonderful. One of the most successful European arcade games, and absolutely one of the best ones.
Aïe aïe aïe.
Our next two games take us to the UK and to a company called Xylec Electronics. They're both good, and they're both quite significant in their own way. The Pit made its way out of the UK thanks to Century in the US and Taito in Japan, and it's another cool game based around digging. Although this one is a bit slower and more considered than the likes of Mr. Do and Dig Dug, and amusingly, according to co-creator Andy Walker's interview with Paul Drury in Retro Gamer, the idea for the game started out with a bug in a game called Andromeda where a spaceship's fin would paint the screen in pixels, but would then tunnel through them when it went through a second time. Andy and his colleague, Tony Gibson, felt there was a game in that. Anywho, you have an explorer and they need to dig their way through the ground, collecting gems. In particular, they must collect one or more larger gems from the cavern at the bottom before returning to their spaceship. Monsters will pursue them, although they can be blasted, but many other threats remain. Boulders that'll crush you, arrows that'll shoot you, and a pit of acid that you will need to quickly cross the bridge over before it breaks and you fall into it. And of course there's a timer, very coolly represented by a tank called the Zonka that's shooting a path towards your spaceship, ultimately trapping you underground if you take too long. It is graphically very simple indeed, but the play is once again exceptional. You quickly become very familiar with this single level, and although you will undoubtedly die a lot, you'll find your ideal path through, something that you can gradually hone to become perfect, although there will still be plenty of trouble in your way. The game initially landed in a bit of hot water stateside due to Dig Dug's American distributors, Atari, thinking it was way too similar to that game. However, The Pit only came out a couple of weeks after Dig Dug did, and in fact had its US copyright registered a couple of weeks before Dig Dug's, so clearly neither title was ripping off the other. Indeed, The Pit is one of those games that's way more important than you might think. Specifically, Peter Leeper, the creator of Boulder Dash, cited The Pit as his main influence. Now you think of all the games that Boulder Dash influenced, there's a lot. However, this is the one that influenced Boulder Dash. It is not a very well remembered game today, but it was a considerable hit, and in many ways, the start of something quite special in the UK gaming industry. Picking up on that side of the story, we next go to Blue Print, another Xylec arcade game from September 1982 that was published by Bally Midway in the US and Jaleco in Japan. The maze is here again, and we have to collect things, but this time the twist is that you need to collect parts for a strange Rube Goldberg-esque machine that our hero, JJ, is building. This machine will fire basketballs up to the top of the screen and rescue his girlfriend Daisy from Olioga, who's chasing her up there. In short, it's the sort of weird contraption you might expect Wile E. Coyote to knock up in a few seconds as a means of trying to stop Roadrunner. You find the parts in the maze's houses, although some of them contain bombs which need to quickly be disposed of down a chute, and there's no indication of the houses you've been into already. The idea is to try and go into each house only once in order to get the parts while picking up as few bombs as possible. You pick up another one if you go into a house for a second time, all while not being distracted either by bugs that are patrolling the maze, flower pots that get chucked in your direction, or a monster called Sneaky Pete that's going to try and attack the start button, messing up your work, and who also needs to be thrown into the pit. Initially, this doesn't appear to be too difficult, but trust me, it's easy to get a little confused, and if you pick up too many bombs you will run into a situation where you just can't get them to the pit in time, even if you walk fast. It's a fine game, and it proved to be another worldwide hit. which makes one wonder how Xylec, a little arcade game company based in Burton-on-Trent, managed to get such a big break. Well, the answer generally lies with an influential American man named Joel Hochberg and the two people who'd struck up contact with him, that being Tim and Chris Stamper, the guys who made this game and were, at the time, working at Xylec. The Stampers hit it off with Hochberg, who pushed their games and others by Xylec, including The Pit, outside of Europe through his company called Coinit. A few years later, Hochberg would be one of the key figures in the formation of Rare. He brought the Stampers their first Famicom and oversaw the company's American operations as a director for many years. Again, these are reasons why both Blueprint and The Pit, which was also handled by Hochberg and the Stampers, were both really frickin' important titles. And happily, they're also really frickin' good titles. Most of the games in these Treasures vids are titles that I think are good, or they're important in some way or another. However, it is nice to spare a bit of time at the end of a video for games that are, well, interesting in another way. A theme in these early videos has been the changing fortunes of cinematronics. We saw their big Tim Skelly-helmed Vector hits in 1980, and in 1981 we saw things wane with games like Boxing Bugs that were good but flopped, as well as the unreleased and frankly rather poor War of the Worlds game. In 1982, things aren't getting much better, although we're not doing Vector this time. Instead, we're looking at Cinematronics trying their hand at plucking something from Japan and seeing if they could make a hit that way. The golden age is full of American companies making terrific choices in this department. Bally Midway scored Pac-Man, Atari and Namco did many things together, Century worked with Konami. And so what did Cinematronics pluck from that ever-so-exotic land of the rising sun, as no doubt some idiot over there called it? Well, they hit up Hara Electronics for 5,000 hardware boards that they would hopefully use in their next big hit, Jack the Giant Killer, pretty much the company's first raster-based title. Why they did things this way is frankly beyond anyone's logic. The boards had virtually no documentation, they had to be reverse engineered, the deal was seemingly very expensive, and the final product? Well, it's bloody dreadful. Do you remember when Rodney and Mickey Pierce bought all those broken lawnmower engines? Well, this coin-op reminds me of that. It's a complete mess of a game where you go through 4 stages, initially scaling the hideous-looking beanstalk before jumping on clouds, trying not to wake the giant as you steal his treasure, and then making your way down. The controls are dodgy in the extreme, the graphics are gruesome, and seemingly no one wanted to lay claim to this one. I am actually not sure if this game itself was made in Japan or the States, but seemingly no one wants to actually claim responsibility for it. The game flopped so hard that it ended up getting the unfortunate nickname of Jack the Company Killer, and Cinematronics did indeed file for Chapter 11 later on in 1982. Happily, things would briefly improve for them in 1983, although Dragon's Lair is much too well known a game for us to cover. Our final title is, well, very odd indeed. Now, I didn't think that, after previously covering I'm Sorry by Sega, that I would find another arcade game that had such strong political themes. And of course, I was wrong. Why? Because here's Abscam from 1982, a Pac-Man clone that is based around, of all things, an FBI sting operation in which corrupt congressmen were caught out making dealings with a fictional company called Abdul Enterprises, staffed by various Arab sheiks that were, in fact, FBI officers in disguise. This satirical effort was developed by a company named GL that made Piranha from the previous vid, and it was published by US Billiards. The aim is to collect the dollar signs using your dodgy representative while avoiding the FBI vans, and the power pellet is a special dollar sign that increases the politician's influence, turning the vans into money bags that you can collect. Strange stuff indeed, and we've got more of a maze to travel around here as opposed to what we've got in Piranha, including representations of the Capitol building and what I am kind of sure is the J. Edgar Hoover building, as well as 2 depictions of old Abraham Lincoln. You know, it's a shame that Lincoln doesn't have a little tear in his eye, crying at all this corruption, a la the Statue of Liberty from the Onion's Stan Kelly editorials. Anyway, there's not exactly a whole lot to say about Abscam as a game. It certainly wasn't as successful as Piranha, and is indeed as obscure as all hell, but it sure wins the day when it comes to strange subjects to base a freaking arcade game off of. I mean, a real-life FBI sting involving fake companies and politicians? Yeah, you don't get that in games often, do you? And with that, we are done with 1982. 1983 will certainly see more interesting efforts. We'll have laserdiscs, more European games, a popular gun game, and no doubt some other obscure titles that are either worthy of recognition or just utterly weird in the extreme. Perhaps you will join me for that, but hopefully you've enjoyed this little video, and until the next time, well, bye for now.